Okay, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the processes that happen when cultures meet, or when one person meets another culture, or when a person goes from one culture to another and then back. The first idea is that as a person growing up, as we define culture, it is something which is learned and feels natural. It feels like this is the right way of being. And everything else feels quite odd. This gives us the idea that you have a home culture. And that's going to be the standard which generally people have in order to compare everything else that goes on in the world. Now, when that happens, there's a term for that. That process is called ethnocentricity. Ethno, as in ethnic, centricity, central, that is central to his life. So when you find something which seems so particularly odd because it's from another culture and it can't be right, then, well, you find that you're measuring that other culture according to your own culture. So when a woman who was working for us once told me that her mother would be selling dogs for food in Guatemala, I think it was, we felt very put off by it. But it's not that she was taking the pet, the local pet, from a pet store and selling it for food. It was a specific breed that was, and why shouldn't you? Or there even is a push in our culture to do something slightly different in as far as food is concerned. And you can find this on the TED lectures, TED.org, that a push to eat insects. Now, of course, I wouldn't do that because of my own religious mores, but plentiful. There's certainly a huge amount of insects around. They are nutritious, very high in protein. Do they taste good? Well, I'm not going to try it. But why not? There are cultures that do. And so it's something which we would, if we measure it in a matter of not being right in some way, as far as ethnicity goes, well, that would only be what we call ethnocentric types of judgment. Judging from my perspective as being right and others being wrong. Now, the opposite of that is called cultural relativism. And that's the belief that behaviors and customs of any culture should be viewed and analyzed according to the culture's own standards, which is certainly seems to be a much more equitable way of looking at things. It certainly would be something which makes sense because we're not talking about something which is moral or immoral as far as across the board moralities. We're talking about something which is, if you talk about, you go to England and then you find they're driving on the wrong side of the road and the driver's in the wrong side of the car. Well, what does that mean, wrong? What makes one wrong and one right? No, you judge it because it certainly is right for them. So that would be called cultural relativity. So that's obviously those two points of view which one has to keep in mind when talking about culture and movements from culture or comparisons of one culture to the other. Now, certainly, when one moves from one culture to the other, not only judging, if you hear about it or something like that, if you need to, for some reason or another, move from one culture to another, then it takes an awful lot of getting used to what's going on. If you come from a culture where everybody stands in line to get on the bus, right? And then you go to a place where everybody's pushing to get on the bus, and you'll think, well, that's certainly wrong, but you don't get on the bus because you refuse to stand, you won't push through. So you might have a problem with that. And all that and getting used to that, the difficulty of getting used to that, that's called culture shock. Culture shock meaning that it is difficult for a person to rearrange his sense of values of what's being right or wrong in order to acclimatize and get used to that new culture. And of course, it's that disorientation that the person has, but moving from a radically different culture is depending upon how much a person is prepared for the shock and how different it is, and how how different it is. Let me read to you a passage of from a anthropologist who went to study the Yanomamo Tribe. There are about 2,000 people, 20,000 people in South America, and they live in the rainforest. And this fellow, his name was Napoleon Chagnon, I believe that's how you say it, in 1992, went to visit them. He went to live there and to live there and understand their culture. So he was a guy who really understood that he was going to a different culture, and it took him 3 days in a aluminum motorboat to travel upriver to meet these people. Okay, so what happened when he got there? Let me read what he says here. He says like this, and he was not prepared to what he actually saw. I looked up and gasped to see a dozen burly, naked, sweaty, hideous men staring at us down the shafts of their drawn arrows. Immense wads of green tobacco were stuck between the lower teeth and the lips, making them look even more hideous, and strands of dark green slime dripped from their nostrils. Strands so long that they reached down to their pectoral muscles or drizzled down their chins and stuck to their chests and bellies. We arrived as the men were blowing ebane, a hallucinogenic drug, up their noses. I was horrified. What kind of welcome was this for someone who has come to live with these people and learn their way of life, to become friends with them? But when they recognized Barker, who was the guide, they put their weapons down and returned to their chanting while keeping a nervous eyes on the village entrances. So you see that because it was so strange and hideous, he obviously was measuring according to his own culture. For them, that was normal. Or when you take a sociologist who is studying poor people in rural soup kitchens, and he goes to live with them, and he drinks from the cups that are passing around, the styrofoam cups, and at one point he realizes that, you know what, it looks like there are teeth marks on the cup that he's given, but he tries to ignore it. And then he looks again, and he goes again to next time, and he sees that they're actually recycled, and somebody else had used the styrofoam cup, and there are tooth marks in it. And he had a hard time drinking from it afterwards. But that was the way these people are living. And this was a great deal of culture shock. So this is something which really becomes very difficult. And it becomes difficult in many, many different situations. A woman in my class moved... African-American woman moved to a rural city, as a girl, moved to a rural city in Mississippi, I believe it was, where their standards of racial acceptance was somewhat akin to the early 60s or late 50s, where they didn't really accept colored people. Coming from New York City, that was quite a shock. Her parents moved there because it was a very good school system, but it still became quite a problem for them. Additionally, think of this again. It doesn't only happen when you move from one culture to another. Take somebody who's lived in one culture, moved to another, started to acclimatize, and then moved back. You can still have quite a bit of culture shock in that case. Quite a bit. That's called reentry shock. And it's very difficult to readjust. You find this very often with soldiers who come from home, then go deployed overseas, and then come back. People who work in overseas in all situations, because they begin to change their way of seeing things, and it takes time to readjust, and that's called reentry shock. Very very common and important concept to remember. Because we talked about then ethnocentrism, cultural relativism, culture shock, reentry shock. Of course, there's one other concept that has to be known as that's reverse ethnocentrism, which unfortunately can happen quite a lot. And that's when people decide that, you know what, everybody else's culture is better than mine. I'd rather live there than here. The green is grass or on the other side, as people say. Oh, and that is an extremely important concept that is used quite a lot. Maybe we need to look at the Japanese as the wonderful society because, after all, their children do much better in math and they have such strong families. Or maybe the cultural system of Finland is much better because there are no poor people and there are no rich people. So maybe their culture is much better than the American culture, where we have a great amount of poor people and a very small amount of wealthy people. Well, that might be considered reverse ethnocentrism because, in truth, every system has its positives and its negatives.